The text came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, while I was standing in a conference room I built with my own two hands, looking at a set of blueprints for a $40 million hospital wing my company was about to wire from the ground up. Don't even think about showing up for Christmas, Holt. Things are complicated enough this year. I read it twice. Then a second message landed right behind it, from the same thread, my father this time. You always make things tense. We just want one peaceful holiday. I want you to understand something before I go any further. For 23 years, I had been the reason there was a holiday at all. I had been the reason there was a house to gather in, heat to keep it warm, food on the table, and presents under the tree for grandchildren who called me nothing but Uncle Holt when they bothered to call me anything. 23 years of quietly making sure my parents never had to worry about a mortgage payment, a medical bill, or a car note. 23 years of watching my younger sister get celebrated for a business that only existed because I was the one paying to keep the lights on in it. 23 years of being the invisible son standing just outside the family photo, the one nobody thought to save a seat for, the one everybody assumed would keep showing up anyway. And they were right to assume that. Until that Tuesday. I stood there in my own conference room, in my own company, the one I built from nothing starting when I was 22 years old with a tool belt and a used pickup truck, and I felt something in my chest go very, very quiet. Not loud. Not explosive. Quiet, in the way a room goes quiet right before something breaks. I typed one word back. Understood. That was it. No argument. No pleading. No, what did I do this time? Just one word, because I had already decided, somewhere underneath the part of me that was still hurt, that this was the last time I was ever going to ask my family to make room for me. 3 days later, both of my parents would be standing in their own driveway, watching movers carry their furniture out onto the lawn, calling my phone over and over while I let it ring. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and you deserve to know how we got there, because it didn't start with a text message. It started 23 years earlier, with a bankruptcy notice and a promise nobody asked me to make. My name is Holt Ashworth. I'm 47 years old, I live just outside Detroit, Michigan, and I own an electrical contracting company that does wiring for hospitals, office towers, and shopping centers across 3 states. 34 employees. A little over $9 million a year in revenue. I built every bit of it starting from an apprenticeship that paid me $14 an hour. None of that mattered to my family. Not really. Not in the way it should have. I have a wife, Wren, who has watched me hand over pieces of myself to people who never once said thank you, and 2 kids, Anson and Beatrix, who have grown up learning that their grandparents show up for everyone except them. I have a sister, Marisol, 3 years younger than me, who has spent her entire adult life being celebrated for things I quietly paid for. And I have parents, Roland and Adelaide, who I have loved my whole life in the desperate, complicated way you love people who have never quite loved you back the same way. For 23 years I sent money and never sent a bill. I paid down a mortgage with my name nowhere on the welcome mat. I guaranteed a business loan for a sister who introduced me at her own launch party as my brother. He's around sometimes. I covered my father's heart surgery and let him tell the neighbors he'd figured it out himself. I did all of it quietly, because that's who I was raised to be, or maybe just who I decided to be somewhere along the way, without anyone actually asking me to. I never set out to become the family's safety net. Nobody sits a 24-year-old down and says, "Congratulations, you're the responsible one now. This is your job for the rest of your life." It happens slowly, in small decisions that feel reasonable in the moment. You cover one bill because it's an emergency. You cover a second one because refusing feels cruel. By the time you notice the pattern has calcified into an identity, you're already 30, then 40, then staring down a text message on a Tuesday morning wondering how 23 years slipped by without anyone once asking if you were tired. I was tired. I just hadn't let myself say it out loud, not even to Wren, not fully, not until the week everything finally broke open. And then, on a Tuesday morning in December, after everything I had given, after everything I had quietly carried so nobody else would have to feel the weight of it, my own parents told me I wasn't welcome at Christmas. I want to tell you exactly how that happened. I want to tell you about the years before it, The years that filled up like sediment until there was nowhere left for the pressure to go except out. Because by the time you get to the end of the story, I don't think you're going to be asking whether I went too far. I think you're going to be asking why it took me 23 years to stop. If you want to understand why that text message hit me the way it did, you have to understand that it wasn't really about Christmas. It was about a pattern so old it had its own weight, its own gravity, like a scar you stop noticing until someone presses right on it. I was 24 years old the first time I quietly stepped in to save my family. My father owned a small auto body shop back then, the kind of place with his name painted on the window in gold letters he'd paid too much for. He'd built it up over 15 years, and I'd spent half my childhood sweeping the floors of that shop after school, proud of the smell of paint and metal, proud of my dad. Then a bad year turned into a bad 2 years, and the shop folded under debt he never told anyone about until the letters started coming with red lettering on the envelopes. I remember sitting at their kitchen table the night my mother finally told me how bad it was, her hands shaking around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking from. My father wouldn't even look at me. A grown man, ashamed in his own kitchen. I was an electrician's apprentice back then, making next to nothing, but I had just enough saved up, along with a cosign loan I never should have qualified for, to keep them from losing the house. Nobody asked me to do it. I just did it, because the alternative was watching my parents lose everything, and something in me decided that could never happen while I had breath in my body. That was supposed to be a one-time thing. A bridge to get them through a hard year. It became the architecture of the next 2 decades of my life. Let me walk you through the museum, because that's what it feels like now, looking back. A museum of moments where the pattern kept repeating, each one a small exhibit in a much larger exhibition of being taken for granted. Exhibit 1. 2 years after I saved the house, I graduated with my electrical contractor's license and started my own small outfit, just me and one used van with my name on the side. Nobody in my family came to see the first office I rented, a converted garage barely big enough for a desk. But 3 months later, when my sister Marisol graduated from her 2-year event planning program, my parents rented out the back room of a restaurant and invited 40 people. Exhibit 2. When my father had his heart attack 11 years ago, I was the one who sat in the hospital hallway at 2 in the morning signing insurance forms, and I was the one who quietly paid down the balance the insurance didn't cover, close to $85,000 over the following years between surgery, medication, and follow-up care. My father recovered, and at the next family barbecue, I heard him tell a neighbor, with a straight face, "We handled it ourselves. Thank God for good insurance." Exhibit 3. When Marisol wanted to start her own event planning business 8 years ago, I was the one who sat across from a loan officer and put my name on a guarantee for $95,000, plus another chunk for equipment financing, because her credit wasn't strong enough on its own. At the ribbon cutting for her first office, she thanked our parents for always believing in her. She didn't mention my name once, and when I stood near the back of the small crowd, my own father leaned over and whispered that I should let her have her moment. Exhibit 4. 3 years ago, my daughter Beatrix had a birthday party planned for a Saturday. My parents canceled the morning of, texting that something had come up. That evening, I found out from a photo on social media that the something was a launch dinner for one of Marisol's new event packages. My daughter cried herself to sleep asking why Grandma and Grandpa didn't like her as much as her cousins. Exhibit 5, and maybe the one that sits heaviest, the house my parents still live in right now, the one they raised us in, the one they still call theirs at every holiday gathering. 15 years ago, after the shop failure and a rocky decade of rebuilding, they nearly lost that house to foreclosure a second time. I was the one who refinanced it, structured through my own holding company on the advice of an attorney I trust, a man named Emerson Cole, because by then I had learned the hard way that doing things quietly wasn't enough. I needed to do them smart. That house has my company's name buried somewhere in its deed history, in a way my parents have never once acknowledged, maybe because they don't fully understand it, or maybe because understanding it would mean admitting how much they've depended on me. Every single month, without fail, for over 2 decades, money left my accounts and landed in theirs, in Marisol's, in places that kept the illusion of a comfortable, self-sufficient family intact. The mortgage, the insurance, the car payments, college funds for my sister's 3 kids that I quietly funded while my own children's college account sat smaller because I told myself I could always catch up later, that there was always more time. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being essential and invisible at the same time. In being the reason a family survives while also being the person that family is most comfortable leaving out of the picture. I used to think if I just kept giving, eventually they'd see me. Eventually there'd be a dinner with my name on the invitation instead of just my name on the mortgage. I remember one specific evening, maybe 6 years ago, when I actually tried to say something. We were sitting around my parents' kitchen table, the same table where my mother had once told me about the bankruptcy with shaking hands, and I mentioned, as casually as I could manage, that it might be nice to be included a little more in family plans. Not asking for anything. Just saying it out loud, testing the water. My mother laughed it off, the way she laughed off most things that made her uncomfortable. "Oh, Holt, don't be so sensitive. You know we love you the same as everyone else." My father didn't even look up from his plate. Marisol, sitting across from me, rolled her eyes just slightly, just enough that I caught it, and said, "Here we go again." I never brought it up again after that. I told myself it wasn't worth the tension, that peace was more important than being right, that a little bit of hurt feelings was a small price to pay for keeping the family together. I was good at telling myself things like that. I'd had a lot of practice. Looking back now, I think that dinner conversation was its own kind of exhibit, maybe the most important one in the whole museum, because it was the moment I learned that speaking up cost more than it was worth. It taught me to keep swallowing things instead of saying them. It taught me that the only way to be tolerated in my own family was to keep my mouth shut and my checkbook open. I kept waiting for a different kind of dinner for 23 years. One where somebody pulled out a chair for me before I had to ask. My wife Ren used to ask me why I never said anything, why I let year after year pass without demanding so much as a thank you. I never had a good answer for her. I think some part of me was scared that if I stopped giving, I'd find out the truth. That the love was never really there to begin with, that it was always just the money they wanted, dressed up in enough affection to make it bearable. I didn't want to know that. So I kept paying. And I kept showing up. Until the year I stopped being invited to show up at all. By this past year, the pattern I'd lived with my whole adult life had started to sharpen into something I couldn't ignore anymore, no matter how hard I tried. It started small, the way these things always do. Thanksgiving, 6 weeks before that Tuesday text message, my father called to say they were keeping it small this year, just close family, nothing fancy. I told him that sounded nice, that Ren and the kids and I would bring the sweet potatoes like always. We pulled up to my parents' house that afternoon and counted 15 cars in the driveway and along the curb. I sat in my truck for a full minute before I could make myself walk inside. Ren reached over and put her hand on my arm, not saying anything, because by then she'd learned there wasn't anything to say that would make it hurt less. Inside, the house was full. Aunts, cousins, my sisters-in-laws, people I barely recognized, all gathered around a table set for 18. There was no seat for us. My mother scrambled to pull 2 folding chairs from the garage, apologizing in that breezy way she had, like it was a funny little mix-up instead of the 5th or 6th time it had happened over the years. Marisol didn't even look up from her phone. Later that night, driving home with Ren in the passenger seat and the kids asleep in the back, I finally said out loud what I'd been swallowing for hours. 15 cars, Ren. 15. And they told me to keep it small. My voice didn't shake. That was the strange part. I'd expected it to shake, and instead it just came out flat, tired, like a fact I was reading off a piece of paper. Ren reached over and turned the radio down. "You keep doing this to yourself," she said, gently, not unkindly. "You keep hoping this time will be different, and then you're surprised when it isn't." She wasn't wrong. She was rarely wrong about things like that. I just wasn't ready to hear it yet, not fully, not in a way that would have changed anything I did next. "They're my parents," I said, like that explained everything, like it was supposed to be enough of an answer to close the subject. Ren didn't push. She just reached over and squeezed my hand on the steering wheel, and we drove the rest of the way home in a silence that had become familiar over the years. The particular silence of two people who both know something is wrong and have simply run out of new ways to say it. A month after that, she launched a new premium package for her event planning business, something called the Platinum Celebration Experience, at a party her parents threw for her at a rented event space downtown. I found out about it from a friend of a friend who saw the flyer, because I hadn't been invited, despite the fact that the $95,000 loan with my signature on it was the only reason that business had survived its first 2 shaky years. I want to be honest with you. I wasn't angry yet. Not really. I was still doing that thing I'd always done, the thing where I found a reason it was fine, a reason it made sense, a reason that had nothing to do with the idea that maybe my family simply didn't think I mattered as much as everyone else at that table. But my kids were starting to notice, and that's the part that finally started to crack something loose in me. My son Anson, 16 years old, sat me down in the garage one night while I was tinkering with an old radio, something I do when I need my hands busy and my mind quiet. He asked me, flat out, why Grandpa never came to any of his baseball games, but he'd seen pictures of Grandpa at every single one of his cousin's soccer matches. I didn't have a good answer for my own son. I gave him some version of "grandparents get busy," and I watched him nod in a way that told me he didn't believe it, because he was smart enough to see the pattern even if I'd spent 2 decades pretending not to. My daughter Beatrix, 13, asked her mother once why Grandma always remembered her cousins' birthdays, but needed reminders for hers. Wren told me about that conversation with tears in her eyes, standing in our kitchen after the kids had gone to bed, and something in me went very still. I had accepted being invisible. I had built a strange kind of peace around it, telling myself that as long as I kept the family financially safe, the rest didn't matter. But I could not accept my children learning that lesson too. I could not sit back and watch them grow up believing that love has to be earned through usefulness, the way I had believed it my entire life. That was the season something in me started to shift, quietly, underneath the surface, the way weather shifts before a storm actually breaks. I started paying closer attention. I started noticing the small comments, the little digs disguised as jokes, the way my father would introduce me at gatherings as our other kid, the busy one, like my presence needed an excuse before anyone even asked for one. I started keeping a mental list, though I didn't know yet what I was building toward. I just knew the ground under me had started to feel different. Less solid. Like something was coming, even if I couldn't name it yet. I didn't know that within a few weeks, I'd overhear a phone call that would tell me exactly what my family really thought of me, in words so plain there'd be no way left to explain them away. Before I tell you about that phone call, I need you to understand the full shape of what I'd built, and what I stood to lose, because none of what happens next makes sense without the numbers behind it. I'm not a person who likes to talk about money. Where I come from, you don't announce what's in your bank account, you just quietly make sure everyone around you is taken care of, and you let people believe whatever story makes them comfortable. But if you're going to understand why my family's Christmas text hit as hard as it did, you need to understand exactly what I had been carrying, month after month, year after year, without a single one of them fully grasping the weight of it. I built my company slowly, brick by brick, contract by contract, starting with residential wiring jobs that paid barely enough to cover gas money, working my way up to commercial projects, then to the kind of large-scale jobs that put my name in front of developers and general contractors across the state. Every dollar I made with my own hands, my own risk, my own sleepless nights wondering if I'd made payroll that month. And almost every spare dollar beyond what my own household needed, I funneled quietly toward the people who never once asked how I was doing while they cashed the benefits of my labor. I don't say that to make myself sound like a martyr. I say it because I think it's important for you to understand that this wasn't inherited wealth being casually redirected. This was money I earned with blistered hands and 18-hour days, money that represented years of my life, and every single dollar of it went toward keeping a family stable that couldn't be bothered to save me a seat at their own table. Every month, like clockwork, $2,100 left my account and went toward my parents' mortgage. Their house, the one they still called theirs at every holiday, the one where 15 cars had crowded the driveway at Thanksgiving while my own family sat on folding chairs. Every month, another $980 covered my father's ongoing medical costs and insurance premiums, a quiet continuation of the $85,000 I'd already spent getting him through heart surgery over a decade earlier. Every month, $1,850 kept my sister's event planning business afloat, covering overhead costs that her books never quite balanced without a little help nobody talked about. Every month, $1,320 covered car payments, mine listed as a cosigner on vehicles that were never mine to drive. And every month, $1,500 went into college savings accounts for my sister's 3 children, money I set aside gladly because I never wanted those kids to suffer for their mother's financial habits, even while my own children's college funds grew slower than they should have. Add it up, and you're looking at somewhere around $7,750 a month, every month, for over 2 decades. Some years it was less, back when I was younger and still building my company. Other years, especially after my father's surgery, it climbed higher. But averaged out across 23 years, the total came to a little over $1,340,000. I didn't know that exact number myself until I sat down with my accountant and my attorney, Emerson Cole, and had them run it for me properly. Emerson had helped me structure most of this years earlier, back when I refinanced my parents' house to save it from a second foreclosure. At the time, I told him I just wanted to protect them. What I didn't fully understand back then was that I was also, without quite meaning to, protecting myself, building a legal foundation that meant I wasn't just a son who paid bills quietly. I was, in every way that mattered on paper, the actual financial backbone of that entire house, the deed carrying my company's fingerprints in ways my parents had never bothered to ask about, let alone thank me for. Emerson had said something to me once, years back, sitting across his desk with the refinancing papers spread out between us. He said, "Holt, I hope you never need this, but you should know exactly what you're holding here." I remember nodding, filing it away, not really believing I'd ever need to think about it again. I thought about it a lot, sitting in my truck outside my parents' house after that Thanksgiving with the 15 cars in the driveway. I thought about it again after Marisol's launch party I wasn't invited to. And I thought about it constantly in the weeks after, turning it over in my mind like a stone I couldn't quite put down. Here's the thing about being the invisible provider in a family like mine. You start to believe the arrangement is permanent, unbreakable, a law of nature rather than a choice you keep making every single month. You forget that you hold actual power in that relationship, because the story your family tells about themselves doesn't include you holding any power at all. I was about to be reminded, in the ugliest way possible, that I had never stopped holding it. The call that changed everything came from a woman named Josephine Calder, my mother's closest friend and next-door neighbor for as long as I could remember. Josephine had known me since I was in diapers. She used to slip me extra cookies at church potlucks when my mother wasn't looking. She meant to call my mother that afternoon. Instead, her thumb slipped on a contact list that still had my number saved from years earlier, back when I used to help her with her home security system as a favor. Josephine and my mother had been planning the Christmas gathering together for weeks by that point, the way they always did, comparing notes on side dishes and seating arrangements over the fence between their 2 yards. My mother must have looped my father and Marisol into a call about final details, and somewhere in the shuffle of hanging up one line and dialing another, Josephine's phone connected to me instead. The call sitting open and silent on my end for a full 10 seconds before anyone said a word I could make sense of. I picked up expecting Josephine's usual warm chatter about the neighborhood or the weather. What I got instead was the tail end of a 3-way call she hadn't realized was still connected, my father's voice coming through clear as day, along with my sister's, the 2 of them mid-conversation, completely unaware that anyone else was listening. "He's going to be fine," my father was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable. "Just let him feel useful. Don't let him think he's running this family, but for God's sake, don't cut off the money either. We need this Christmas to go smooth." Marisol laughed, an easy, familiar laugh, The kind you use when you're talking about something that doesn't cost you anything to say out loud. Dad, relax, she said. I've got Holt handled. He's predictable. He just wants to feel included, so we throw him a bone every once in a while and he keeps writing checks. It's not that complicated. There was more. There's always more. But I want to be honest with you about what those 2 sentences did to me, because it wasn't the explosion you might expect. There was no shouting, no phone thrown across the room, no dramatic moment where I demanded answers. Something in my chest just went cold. Quiet and cold, the way a house goes quiet in the moment right after the power cuts out, before you even realize what's happened. I sat in my truck in the parking lot outside a job site, engine running, heat blowing on my hands, and I listened to my own father describe me as an asset to be managed. I listened to my sister call 23 years of sacrifice handled, like I was a line item on a spreadsheet instead of a person who had spent half his life making sure they never had to feel the ground shift under them. Josephine finally realized her call hadn't disconnected and came back on the line, mortified, apologizing over and over, telling me she was so sorry. She didn't know what to say. Please don't tell your mother I called you by mistake. I told her it was fine. I told her I wouldn't say anything. I hung up the phone and sat there for a long time. I want you to understand something about who I was before that phone call and who I became after it. Before, I was a man who gave because giving felt like the only language my family understood, the only currency that ever seemed to buy even a little bit of their attention. I told myself that as long as I kept giving, eventually it would turn into something real. Eventually the checks would become love, the way water eventually wears down stone. After that phone call, I understood something I'd spent 23 years refusing to see. It was never going to turn into love. It was never going to become anything other than exactly what my father called it. Management. A predictable resource. A bone thrown to keep the dog quiet. I drove home that evening in silence. Ren took one look at my face when I walked through the door and asked me what happened, and for the first time in our marriage, I told her everything, every exhibit in that museum of unfairness, laid out in a voice so flat and calm it scared her more than if I'd been shouting. She didn't tell me what to do. She just held my hand across the kitchen table and said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." I sat up long after Ren went to bed, alone at that kitchen table, running the conversation over and over in my mind like a scene I couldn't stop rewinding. I thought about every check I'd written, every form I'd signed, every quiet sacrifice I'd made and never once mentioned, because mentioning it felt like keeping score, and I never wanted to be the kind of son who kept score with his own parents. But somewhere in the replaying of that phone call, a different thought started to surface, one I'd never quite let myself think before. Keeping score wasn't the problem. The problem was that I'd been the only one playing the game honestly. My father had been keeping score the entire time, just not the kind of score that showed up in a ledger. He'd been calculating exactly how much affection he needed to dispense to keep the money flowing, and it turned out the answer was almost none at all. I thought about my son Anson, sitting in the garage asking why Grandpa never came to his games. I thought about my daughter Beatrix, learning that love in this family came with conditions attached, conditions she hadn't met and didn't understand. And I realized, sitting alone in my kitchen at nearly midnight, that the version of myself who kept quietly paying and quietly hoping wasn't just failing himself anymore. He was teaching his own children exactly the lesson I'd spent my whole life trying to unlearn. That was the thought that finally moved something loose in my chest. Not the anger. Not even the humiliation of hearing myself described as handled. It was the fear that my kids might grow up believing the same lie I had believed for over 2 decades, that love has to be purchased, that belonging has to be earned through usefulness, that you can buy your way into a family's heart if you just keep writing the checks long enough. I wasn't willing to let that lie live one more generation. That night, after the kids were asleep, I opened the safe in my home office and pulled out a folder I hadn't looked at in years. Copies of the refinancing documents on my parents' house. Copies of the loan guarantee for Marisol's business. Every account, every guarantee, every quiet thread of financial dependence I had spent 2 decades weaving through my family's life, all of it right there in black and white, all of it still very much within my power to pull. I called my Uncle Garrison that night, my father's younger brother, the one person in my extended family who had always seen me clearly. I needed to hear another human voice before I let myself think any further down the road my mind had already started walking. What Garrison told me next would change the timeline of everything that was about to happen. Garrison picked up on the second ring. He always did, even at 10 at night, because that's the kind of man he was, the kind who answers when family calls, no questions asked, no excuses made. I told him everything. The Thanksgiving with 15 cars and no chairs for us. The launch party I wasn't invited to. Josephine's accidental call. My father's voice describing me like a resource to be managed. My sister's easy laugh, as she called 2 decades of sacrifice handled. Garrison was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he said something that changed the shape of everything. "Holt, I probably should have told you this a long time ago," he said. "About a year back, your father asked me if I knew a good real estate attorney. Said he wanted to look into transferring the house into Marisol's name, get it settled before he and your mother get any older. I told him I didn't think that was a good idea, given everything you've put into that place, but he brushed it off. Said something like, Holt won't mind, he's not the sentimental type about that stuff." I sat with that for a long moment, the phone pressed to my ear, my other hand flat against the kitchen counter like I needed something solid to hold on to. My father had been quietly exploring how to move the house I had refinanced, the house my company's fingerprints were legally woven into my sister's name, without ever once mentioning it to me. Not because he thought I'd say no, because he assumed I wouldn't care enough to notice. That was the moment the plan stopped being a vague, painful possibility floating somewhere in the back of my mind and became something concrete. I called my attorney, Emerson Cole, the next morning before his office had even officially opened, and I told him I needed to talk. He cleared his schedule for me that afternoon. I sat across from him in the same office where, 15 years earlier, we had drawn up the paperwork that saved my parents' house the first time. I laid out everything. The phone call. What Garrison had told me. 23 years of numbers I finally wanted to see in front of me in black and white. Emerson listened without interrupting, the way good attorneys do, and when I finished, he opened a drawer and pulled out the original file, the one with my name buried in the fine print of a deed my parents had never bothered to read closely. "You have more power here than you've ever used," he told me. "The mortgage refinancing structure gives you standing to call the note if you choose to. The business guarantee for your sister can be withdrawn with proper notice, which would trigger an immediate repayment demand from the bank. The insurance policies list you as primary account holder on the family plan, which means you can cancel coverage at will. Holt, I want to be clear with you. If you do this, there's no undoing it. This isn't a warning shot. This is the whole thing." I told him to prepare everything. Every document, every notice, every piece of paperwork required to unwind 23 years of quiet support in a single, coordinated motion. I told him not to file anything yet. I wanted to give my family one more chance, even though some small, tired part of me already suspected how that chance would end. I still don't fully know why I did that. Maybe some part of me wanted to be wrong about all of it. Maybe I wanted one more Christmas where they proved me wrong. Garrison stayed on the phone with me a long time that night, longer than he probably needed to. He'd watched this pattern unfold for over 2 decades, from the outside, unable to do much more than shake his head at his own brother's behavior. "I've wanted to say something for years," he told me. "But it wasn't my place, and honestly, Holt, I didn't think you'd believe me if I told you how bad it looked from where I was standing. You always found a reason to defend them." He was right about that. I had spent half my life constructing reasons, elaborate and generous reasons, for behavior that didn't deserve them. My father grew up with nothing, I told myself, so of course he struggles to say the right things. My mother just wants peace, I told myself, so of course she smooths things over instead of standing up for what's fair. Marisol is the baby of the family, I told myself, so of course she got treated differently. I had built an entire cathedral of excuses, brick by brick, the same patient way I'd built my company, except this particular structure had been built to protect the people who hurt me instead of the people who depended on me. "What are you going to do?" Garrison asked, before we hung up. "I don't know yet," I told him, which was true in the moment, even if some part of me already suspected the shape the answer was going to take. The following week, my mother called to ask if I'd be bringing the usual gifts for the grandchildren, same as every year. I told her of course I would, because even then, even after everything, I hadn't fully let go of the hope that showing up one more time might matter. Then came the Tuesday I told you about at the very beginning of this. The text message. My father's follow-up, telling me I made things tense. My own reply, one word, calm and final. Understood. I want you to sit with that word for a second. The way I sat with it that morning in my conference room, blueprints spread out in front of me for a hospital wing I was about to help build from nothing, while my own family decided, without a second thought, that I didn't belong at their table. Because what happened 3 days later wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge born out of some sudden fit of temper. It was 23 years of quiet math finally getting solved. I set my phone down on the conference table that morning and looked out the window at the parking lot below, at my own trucks lined up with my own company name painted on the doors. Trucks I had bought with money I earned by working harder than anyone had ever asked me to. I thought about the folding chairs at Thanksgiving. I thought about the launch party I wasn't invited to. I thought about my father's voice telling my sister to keep me handled, and my sister's easy laugh agreeing that it wasn't complicated at all. For 23 years, I had been the quiet architecture holding my family's life together, and not one of them had ever stopped to wonder what would happen to that architecture if I finally decided to walk away from it. I don't think it had ever occurred to them that I could. I don't think it had ever occurred to them that the invisible sun they'd grown so comfortable overlooking was also the only thing standing between their comfortable life and the reality of having to build one on their own. They were about to find out. If you've made it this far with me, I want you to drop a comment that just says, "I'm win." That's become the signal for the people who actually stick around through the whole story, the ones who understand what it feels like to give everything to people who never once looked back to say thank you. I read every single one of those comments myself, and I promise I'll heart every one I see and reply to as many as I can. Because what's coming next is the part where 23 years of being invisible finally became impossible to ignore. What's coming next is the night I stood at my parents' front door on Christmas Eve, gifts in hand for grandchildren who barely knew my name, and found out exactly how far my own family was willing to go to keep pretending I didn't matter. I had no idea, standing there in my own driveway that Tuesday morning, just how quickly the next 72 hours were going to move, or how permanently they were going to change every single relationship I had spent my whole life trying to hold together with quiet sacrifice and unspoken hope. Christmas Eve fell on a Thursday that year, cold and clear, the kind of Michigan night where your breath hangs in the air like it doesn't want to leave you either. I told myself, right up until the moment I pulled into my parents' street, that I was still deciding what to do. That's a lie I let myself believe for exactly as long as it took to see their porch light on and a wreath on the door, string lights wrapped around the same maple tree I used to climb as a kid. Some part of me, even after everything, still wanted to walk through that door and have it be fine. Still wanted to hand Beatrix's careful, hand-wrapped presents to her cousins and watch their faces light up. Still wanted my father to clap me on the shoulder and say something, anything, that sounded like welcome. I parked at the curb, not in the driveway, because some instinct in me already knew I wasn't fully invited to pull all the way in. Ren stayed in the truck with the kids. We'd already agreed, without saying it out loud, that I'd go up alone first, just to see. I carried an armful of presents up the walkway. Through the front window I could see the whole house lit up warm and gold, the tree glittering in the corner, my sister's 3 kids running circles around the coffee table, my parents' extended family crowded onto the couches, plates of cookies making the rounds. 15 cars all over again, except this time it was Christmas, and this time I already had a pretty good idea of what was waiting for me at that door. I knocked. It took a while. Long enough that I heard voices shift inside, a hush falling over the room the way it does when everyone suddenly remembers something they'd rather not deal with. My father opened the door. Not my mother. Him. He stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door mostly closed behind him, leaving just a sliver of warm light and noise spilling out into the cold. He didn't say Merry Christmas. He didn't say my name. Holt, he said, like my presence was a problem he now had to manage in real time. We talked about this. I brought gifts for the kids, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I'm not asking to stay long. Behind him, the door opened wider, and my mother appeared, arms crossed against the cold, her face doing that particular thing it always did when she was trying to look sorry and firm at the same time. Sweetheart, she started, and I want you to notice that word, because it was the softest thing she'd said to me in months, wrapped around the cruelest thing she was about to do. This isn't your house anymore. You don't need to worry about taking care of us tonight. I stood there on that porch, my breath fogging in the cold air, presents still cradled in my arms, and I almost laughed. Not your house anymore. As if it had ever, in any official sense, needed my worry in the first place, except that it did, every single month, in a way my mother had clearly never let herself think too hard about. I looked past her, through the sliver of open doorway, at the warm gold light spilling out onto the porch, at the tree glittering with ornaments I recognized from my own childhood, at cousins and aunts and uncles laughing over plates of cookies, none of them so much as glancing toward the door to see who'd knocked. 23 years of quiet devotion, and not one person in that room had thought to ask why the porch had gone quiet, why the door had stayed cracked instead of thrown open. Sweetheart, my mother said again, softer this time, like repetition might make the cruelty land gentler. We just need one easy holiday. Can you understand that? I understood it better than she knew. I understood it in a way that made something in my chest go very still, very cold, the exact same stillness I'd felt sitting in my truck listening to my father describe me as something to be handled. That's when Marisol came out too, wrapped in a cardigan, holding a glass of wine, looking at me like I was an inconvenience that had wandered in off the street. Holt, seriously, she said, glancing back toward the house like she was worried the neighbors might hear, which, as it happened, they could, because Josephine Calder and her husband were standing on their own porch across the street, having stepped out for some air, watching every second of this unfold in the cold December dark. You're making this weird. You're making everyone uncomfortable. Can you please just go? I looked at my sister for a long moment. 23 years of quiet checks, of guarantees with my name on them, of a launch party I wasn't invited to, standing right there in front of me wearing a cardigan I was fairly sure I'd indirectly paid for. Sure, I said. I can go. I set the presents down carefully on the porch step, one at a time, the way you'd set down something breakable, because in a way, that's exactly what they were. Then I looked at my father, who still hadn't met my eyes once since he'd opened the door, and I said the only thing I had left to say. Merry Christmas. I turned and walked back down the path, past the maple tree, past the string lights, past 23 years of a family I had built with my own two hands, and had just been asked to leave standing outside of. I didn't look back at the window. I didn't need to. I already knew what I'd see. The warm gold light, the party continuing without missing a beat, like closing a door on me was as easy as closing a door on the cold. Wren was watching from the truck, her face pale in the dashboard light, Anson and Beatrix in the back seat, quiet in the particular way kids go quiet when they understand something is wrong even if nobody's explained it to them yet. I climbed in and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, not turning the key. They wouldn't even let you in, Wren said softly. It wasn't a question. No, I said. They wouldn't. I looked in the rearview mirror at my son, 16 years old, watching me with an expression I recognized because I'd worn it myself 100 times growing up in that house. I looked at my daughter, 13, holding the one present she'd insisted on bringing herself, a small hand-drawn card for her cousin that would now never get delivered. Something in me, some final held breath I'd been carrying my whole adult life, finally let go. I pulled out my phone and called Emerson Cole. It was 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve, and he picked up on the second ring, because I'd told him earlier that week this call might be coming, and Emerson, God bless him, was the kind of man who kept his phone close on the nights that mattered. "It's time," I said. "Everything we talked about. All of it. Tonight, if you can start it, and first thing tomorrow if you can't." There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to hear him set something down on his end. "You're sure?" he said. "Not really a question either." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I told him. I started the truck. In the rearview mirror, I watched my parents' porch light glowing warm against the dark, watched the shape of my sister's silhouette disappear back through the front door, watched 23 years of my own quiet devotion get swallowed up behind a closing door. What none of them knew yet, standing warm and comfortable in that house, was that the paperwork had been sitting ready on Emerson's desk for over a week. What none of them knew was that by the time they woke up on the 26th, expecting nothing more than the usual quiet aftermath of another holiday where I'd been dismissed, their entire financial world was going to look nothing like the one they'd fallen asleep in. We drove home in a silence that wasn't heavy so much as it was final, the kind of silence that settles in after a decision has already been made, even if the details are still being worked out. I put the kids to bed myself that night, something I hadn't done in a long time between the demands of the business and the years of quietly managing my family's finances on top of it. Beatrix asked me, halfway through tucking her in, why Grandma and Grandpa didn't want us there. I didn't have a gentle enough answer for a 13-year-old, so I told her the truth, the simple version of it anyway. "Sometimes people forget how to appreciate what they have, sweetheart. That's on them, not on you." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that stuck with me for the rest of that night and every night after. "I don't think I want presents from people who don't want us there anyway." I sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after she fell asleep. Downstairs, Ren made tea neither of us drank and sat with me at the kitchen table while I laid out, piece by piece, exactly what was about to happen. The mortgage refinancing on my parents' house, structured years earlier through my holding company, gave me the standing to call the note due if I chose to exercise it. The business loan guarantee for Marisol could be withdrawn with formal notice, which would trigger an immediate repayment demand from the bank, one her business had never had the cash reserves to survive on its own. The family insurance policies, listing me as primary account holder, could be canceled outright. "All of it?" Ren asked. "Tonight?" "All of it," I said. "I've spent 23 years hoping they'd choose me back. I'm done hoping." I want to be honest about what that night felt like, because it wasn't the clean, satisfying anger you might expect from a story like this. It was slow and heavy and sad in a way I hadn't fully prepared myself for. I sat at my own kitchen table remembering my father teaching me to change a tire in that driveway when I was 12. I remembered my mother's hands shaking around a coffee cup the night she told me about the bankruptcy, and how proud she looked, just for a moment, when 24-year-old me said I'd figure something out. I remembered a version of this family that I'd loved without complication, before the complications had quietly buried it. Grief and resolve can live in the same chest at the same time. I learned that on Christmas Eve, sitting at my kitchen table at midnight while my wife held my hand and my children slept upstairs, innocent of everything that was about to unfold 2 towns away. I found myself, somewhere around 2 in the morning, pulling out an old photo album Ren had made me years earlier, the kind with actual printed pictures instead of a phone screen. I flipped through pages of my childhood, my father teaching me to ride a bike, my mother's hand on my shoulder at some elementary school assembly, a version of this family that had existed before the pattern calcified into what it eventually became. I didn't cry. I just sat there for a long time, turning pages, saying a quiet kind of goodbye to a version of my family I'd been mourning in small pieces for longer than I'd let myself admit. I called my Uncle Garrison one more time before I finally went to bed, mostly because I needed to hear one more voice tell me I wasn't the villain in this story, even though some tired, aching part of me still wasn't fully convinced. "You gave them 23 years, Holt," Garrison said. "Nobody on this earth could say you didn't try." I didn't sleep much that night. Around 5 in the morning, still dark outside, I got up, made coffee, and drove to Emerson's office before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon, because he'd told me the night before he'd meet me first thing, whatever first thing needed to mean. We sat across from each other at 9 sharp on the morning after Christmas, the same desk where 15 years earlier we'd drawn up papers to save my parents' house from foreclosure. This time, the papers in front of us did the opposite. A formal notice calling the mortgage note due in full, given the terms of the original refinancing agreement. A withdrawal of guarantee on Marisol's business loan, effective immediately, with notification going out to the lender that same morning. A cancellation notice for the family insurance policies, effective at the end of the current billing cycle. A directive to my accountant to close out the joint accounts that had quietly funneled money toward my parents and sister for over 2 decades. I signed every page. My hand didn't shake. I want you to know that, because I think some part of me expected it to, expected some dramatic hesitation at the last second, some final pull toward mercy. It never came. Not because I didn't love them. I think, somewhere underneath everything I still did, in the complicated, scarred-over way you love people who taught you what it feels like to not matter. But love and self-respect had been sitting on opposite sides of a scale in my chest for 23 years, and on that cold morning in Emerson's office, the scale had finally, quietly, tipped all the way over. "It's done," Emerson told me, gathering the signed pages into a folder. "Effective today. The bank will process the note demand and the guarantee withdrawal within 72 hours. The insurance company usually moves a little faster." 72 hours. I remember thinking, as I walked out of that office into the cold morning air, that 72 hours was almost exactly how long I'd waited, 3 days earlier, hoping my family would prove me wrong about what they thought I was worth to them. They hadn't. And now the clock on the other side of that math had started running instead. The first call came in around noon 2 days later, a Saturday, while I was in my workshop garage trying to lose myself in fixing an old radio, the same way I always did when I needed my hands busy and my mind somewhere quiet. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. She called 4 more times over the next hour before finally leaving a message, her voice tight and confused in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Holt, honey, something's wrong with the credit cards. Both of them got declined at the grocery store. Can you call me back? I don't understand what happened." I sat with that voicemail for a long moment before I understood what she meant. Not our credit cards. The credit cards, plural, both of them, the ones tied to the joint account I'd quietly funded for over 2 decades, the one that had covered everything from groceries to gas without either of my parents ever having to think twice about the balance. By that evening, the calls had multiplied. My father, gruffer, more direct, demanding to know what I'd done, why the mortgage company had called about a note demand he didn't understand, why the insurance agent had left a message about a canceled policy. Marisol, somewhere between panicked and furious, texting in all capital letters that her bank had frozen access to her business line of credit and she needed to talk to me immediately. I didn't answer any of them. I'd told Emerson to handle every inquiry through his office from that point forward, and I meant it. 23 years of being the one who explained, who smoothed things over, who made the hard calls so nobody else had to feel the discomfort of them, and I was done being that person. Sunday brought the real unraveling. My father's insurance had lapsed at midnight the night before, which meant the truck he drove to church that morning technically wasn't covered. My mother, according to a message I got secondhand through Garrison, had gone to pay for a prescription refill and found her card declined a second time, this time at the pharmacy counter, with a line of people behind her. Garrison told me she'd had to call him from the parking lot afterward, humiliated, asking if he could spot her $40 until she figured out what was going on with the bank. He did, of course, because that's who Garrison was. But he told me later that it was the first time in his entire life he'd heard his sister-in-law sound genuinely frightened about money, rather than simply inconvenienced by having to think about it at all. And Marisol's business, the one built on a foundation of guarantees she'd never once acknowledged out loud, found out that afternoon that her line of credit had been called due in full, a demand her books had never been positioned to meet without help she could no longer count on. I want to tell you honestly, I didn't feel joy watching this unfold from a distance, the way you might expect after everything I've told you. What I felt was something closer to exhaustion, the particular kind that comes after finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long your arms forgot what it felt like to be empty. Monday morning brought something none of us had planned for, something that turned a private family reckoning into a very public one. A local business journalist named Percival Doyle had been working for weeks on a feature about self-made entrepreneurs across Michigan, the kind of profile piece that runs in regional business magazines highlighting people who built something out of nothing. He'd reached out to me back in the fall for an interview about my company, and I'd given him a few hours of my time, mostly talking about apprenticeships and the value of skilled trade work, never thinking much more about it. His piece ran that Monday morning, timed, as these things sometimes are, entirely by coincidence with everything else that was happening. It laid out, in the kind of clear and public detail I'd never bothered to advertise myself, the full scope of what I'd built. 34 employees. $9 million in annual revenue. A company that had grown from one used van and a $14 an hour apprenticeship into one of the most respected electrical contracting firms in the region. The article got shared around the neighborhood faster than I expected, mostly because Josephine Calder, still shaken from what she'd witnessed on that porch 3 days earlier, sent it to half the people on her block with a caption that simply said, "This is the man they turned away on Christmas Eve." By Monday afternoon, my parents' entire circle, aunts, cousins, old neighbors, people who had spent years hearing vague stories about their complicated oldest son, were suddenly looking at hard numbers that told a very different story than the one my family had always quietly implied. The son they described as difficult, as tense, as someone who made things complicated, turned out to be the reason half of what they enjoyed had been possible in the first place. I heard later, through Garrison, that my father didn't leave the house for 2 days after that article started circulating. That my mother stopped answering calls from her own friends. That Marisol, in particular, found herself fielding uncomfortable questions from clients who'd read the article and started wondering, out loud, how a business that size had really been funded all along. Garrison told me my father sat at his kitchen table for hours the first night, reading the article over and over, the same way I'd read that Christmas Eve text message over and over 3 days earlier. He said my father kept muttering that he didn't understand, that he'd always known I did well for myself, but nothing like this. Nothing close to $9 million a year and 34 employees, and a company respected enough to land a feature in a regional business magazine. I think, in some strange way, the numbers hurt him more than the porch confrontation had hurt me. He'd spent so many years quietly believing he was the one holding the family together, the patriarch who'd rebuilt himself after the shop failed. That seeing in black and white exactly how much of that rebuilding had actually come from his overlooked son cracked something in him he wasn't prepared for. None of that was my intention when I gave Percival Doyle that interview back in the fall. I want to be honest about that. I never asked him to time it, never coordinated it, never once thought about my family while I was talking to him about apprenticeships and blueprints. But I won't pretend I didn't feel something complicated, sitting in my kitchen reading that article for the first time, watching a truth I'd spent 23 years quietly protecting finally step out into the light on its own. If you've made it this far, drop a comment that just says, "I'm Win." That's the signal for the ones who stick with a story all the way through, and I promise, I read every single one, I heart every one I see, and I reply to as many as I possibly can. By Tuesday, formal notices had started arriving at my parents' house. A foreclosure timeline from the mortgage lender, laying out a 90-day window before the process moved forward in earnest. A final notice from the insurance company confirming the lapse. A collections letter for Marisol's business, forwarded to her by a lawyer she'd hired in a panic, one who told her plainly that without the original guarantee, there wasn't much legal ground left to stand on. I didn't gloat. I want you to understand that, because it would be easy, listening to a story like this, to imagine some triumphant, satisfied version of me watching all of it unfold with a smile. That wasn't what this was. I sat in my own home, with my own family, quiet and a little hollowed out, watching 23 years of quiet devotion finally get acknowledged, not with gratitude, but with panic, because gratitude had never once been part of the equation to begin with. The calls kept coming. I kept letting them go to voicemail, one after another, my father's voice growing angrier, my mother's growing more desperate, Marisol's growing more frantic, until finally, on Wednesday morning, 3 days after Christmas, I picked up. Not to give in. Just to finally say what 23 years of silence had never let me say out loud. My father's voice came through hard and fast the second I answered. No hello, no pretense. Holt, what the hell did you do? You're going to lose us the house. Do you understand that? Your mother's a wreck. Your sister's business is falling apart. Call the bank, call the insurance company, fix this. I stood in my garage, phone pressed to my ear, looking at the old radio I'd been half-fixing all week, and for the first time in 23 years, I let myself say the thing out loud instead of swallowing it. I'm not fixing anything, I said. My voice was calm. Calmer than I expected, calmer than his. I spent 23 years fixing things for this family, Dad. Quietly. Without a thank you. Without so much as a seat at the table half the time. I heard what you told Marisol on the phone a few weeks ago. I heard you say to keep me handled. I heard her laugh about it. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear my mother's voice in the background, asking what was happening, and my father's hand muffling the phone for a moment before he came back. That's not what I meant, he said, his voice lower now, less certain. You're twisting it. Maybe, I said. Or maybe for the first time in a long time, I heard exactly what you meant, and I finally believed it. I told him, as plainly as I could, everything I'd been carrying. The mortgage. The medical bills. The business guarantee. The insurance. The college funds for grandchildren who called me nothing but Uncle Holt, if they called me anything at all. $1,340,000, give or take, across 23 years, all of it quiet, all of it unacknowledged, all of it apparently reduced, in my own father's mind, to a resource that needed managing rather than a son who needed loving. You could have just told us you felt that way, he said, and there was something almost wounded in his voice now, which might have moved me once, a year earlier, a decade earlier. I tried, I said. 6 years ago, at your kitchen table. Mom laughed it off. Marisol rolled her eyes. You didn't even look up from your plate. I learned my lesson that day, Dad. I learned that the only version of me this family wanted was the quiet one, the one who kept writing checks and kept his mouth shut. So that's who I became. For 23 years. My mother got on the phone then, crying, asking how I could do this to them, how I could let them lose the house, how I could let Marisol's business collapse, how I could be so cold. I'm not being cold, I told her, and for the first time in that entire conversation, my voice did shake, just slightly, just enough that I had to pause and study it. I'm being honest. For the first time in a very long time, I'm being completely honest with this family, and it turns out honesty feels a lot like what you've been calling cold for years. I told them I wasn't reversing anything. I told them the papers were signed, the accounts were closed, the guarantees were withdrawn, and none of it was coming back. I told them, gently, because some tenderness for them still lived in me even then, that I hoped they'd land on their feet, that I genuinely wasn't trying to destroy them, only to finally stop destroying myself in the process of holding them up. Then I told them I needed some space, real space, not the kind where I quietly kept paying for everything while pretending the distance didn't exist, but actual space, the kind where I could figure out who I was outside of being the family's invisible safety net. I hung up before either of them could respond. The house went into the foreclosure process over the following weeks. My parents, unable to catch up on a mortgage that had ballooned instantly without my quiet monthly contribution, ended up selling before the bank could force the issue, walking away with a little over $50,000 after fees and the outstanding balance. A fraction of what that house had represented to all of us over the years. Marisol's business folded within 2 months, the collections demand too large to absorb without the guarantee that had quietly kept it afloat since the beginning. She laid off her 2 part-time employees, closed the small office she'd been so proud of, and moved her operation back to running events out of her own living room, a version of the business she'd started with before I'd ever put my name on anything. I moved through those weeks in a strange kind of quiet. Not triumphant. Not gleeful. Just steady, in a way I hadn't felt in years, like I'd finally set down a weight I didn't know how heavy it had become until it was gone. Ren and I rented a small cabin for a long weekend that January, just the two of us, our first real time alone together in longer than either of us wanted to admit. I remember sitting on the porch of that cabin, coffee in hand, watching the snow come down and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like my own life belonged entirely to me. We talked, that weekend, about things we hadn't talked about in years. Not logistics, not who needed what from whom, not the quiet math of who was covering which bill. We talked about the early years of our marriage, before the weight of my family's dependence had settled so completely over everything. We talked about a trip to the coast we'd always meant to take and never had the bandwidth for. Ren cried a little on the second night, not from sadness exactly, but from something closer to relief, the particular kind that comes when a weight you've been carrying so long you stopped noticing its shape suddenly isn't there anymore. I keep waiting to feel guilty, I told her, watching the snow pile up against the porch railing. And I don't. I thought I would. Maybe that's how you know, she said, that you waited long enough before you finally did it. 6 months passed before I heard from my mother again. It came in the form of a letter, handwritten, mailed to my office instead of my home, which I understood without needing it explained. She wasn't ready to face Ren, or the kids, or the version of our relationship that would exist once we were standing in the same room again. The letter was short. She wrote that they'd found a small rental apartment across town, smaller than anything they'd lived in since before I was born. She wrote that my father had taken a part-time job doing inventory at a hardware store, something he hadn't done in decades, something that clearly wounded his pride in ways he'd never admit out loud. She wrote that she was sorry, in the careful, guarded way people apologize when they're not entirely sure yet what they're apologizing for. I didn't respond right away. I sat with that letter for almost 2 weeks before I finally asked Emerson to send, on my behalf, a final piece of paperwork I'd been holding onto since the beginning. A check for $100,000, drawn from a personal investment account entirely separate from the company, along with a detailed accounting of everything I had contributed over 23 years. Every mortgage payment, every medical bill, every guarantee, every insurance premium, every quiet transfer that had kept their lives comfortable while mine had gone largely unacknowledged. I didn't send it as an apology, and I didn't send it as an olive branch exactly. I sent it because some part of me needed them to see the number in black and white, needed them to understand, in a way words alone had never managed to convey, exactly what 23 years of being taken for granted had actually cost me, and exactly what I was choosing to walk away from. There was no response for months after that. I heard through Garrison, occasionally, in small updates I never asked for but never turned away either. My father had settled into the hardware store job, gruff about it at first, then, according to Garrison, something almost like proud of it, of earning a paycheck with his own hands again after so many years of not having to think about where the money came from. My mother had picked up part-time work at a local bakery, something she'd always loved, but never needed to do before. Marisol, I heard, had rebuilt her business smaller and slower, taking on only what she could actually afford, learning, the hard way, the parts of running a company that guarantees and quiet family money had always shielded her from. It wasn't easy. I heard she nearly gave it up twice that first year. But she didn't. Garrison told me one story that stuck with me more than the others. Apparently, a few months into a rebuild, Marisol had a client cancel a wedding package 3 weeks out, the kind of loss that would have been absorbed without a second thought back when I was quietly covering her overhead. This time, she had to call the vendors herself, negotiate the deposits down, and absorb what she couldn't recover directly out of her own pocket. Garrison said she cried on the phone with him afterward, not because of the money exactly, but because she said it was the first time in her adult life she'd had to solve a real problem completely on her own, with nobody quietly standing behind her ready to catch the fall. I won't pretend those months were simple for me either. There were nights I missed my parents in a way that had nothing to do with money, Nights I found myself reaching for the phone before remembering the distance I'd chosen. There were moments watching Anson and Beatrix grow, moments I knew their grandparents were missing, that ached in a way I hadn't fully prepared for. But there were other moments too. Anson made varsity that spring, and for the first time in his life, every single person in the stands cheering for him was there because they wanted to be, not because they'd been guilt or paid into showing up. Beatrix started keeping a journal, and one evening she read me a page from it, something about how she used to think love had rules you had to follow perfectly to earn it, and how she was starting to understand that wasn't true. I sat with that for a long time after she went to bed. Ren and I grew closer that year in ways I hadn't expected, the particular closeness that comes from finally putting down a burden you'd both been quietly carrying for a very long time. We took the kids camping that summer, something we'd never had the bandwidth for in years past, always too busy managing the quiet architecture of a family that had never once thanked us for holding it up. It was almost exactly a year to the day after that first text message when the photograph arrived. Marisol sent it, not to my phone, but through Garrison, who forwarded it along with a short note asking if it was all right to pass on. I said yes. It was a simple picture. My parents' new apartment, small but warm, a modest tree in the corner decorated with ornaments I recognized from my own childhood, the ones that had survived every move over the years. My father stood with his arm around my mother, both of them looking a little older than I remembered, a little more tired, but something in their faces looked different too, softer somehow. Less performed than the version of them I'd grown up watching perform for every relative and neighbor who ever walked through their door. Marisol sat cross-legged on the floor with her 3 kids, no cardigan I recognized, no wine glass in hand, just a woman surrounded by her children in a modest apartment she'd furnished herself, on money she'd earned herself, for the first time in longer than any of us could remember. Underneath the photo, she'd written a single line. Independence isn't inherited. It has to be earned. I think I finally understand what you were trying to teach us, even if it took losing everything to learn it. I sat with that message for a long time before I showed it to Ren. I still don't know exactly how I feel about it, even now, telling you this story. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, wanted that message to feel like a victory lap after everything I'd endured. But mostly what I felt was something quieter, something closer to grief mixed with a strange, cautious hope, the kind you feel when you're not sure yet whether to trust that something has actually changed, or whether it's just changed enough to survive one more photograph. I thought about writing back something long, something that tried to explain everything I'd felt over the past year, every ache and every relief, every night I'd missed them, and every morning I'd woken up grateful for the distance. In the end, I sent something much shorter, just a handful of words, because after everything, I found I didn't need to say much more than that. Proud of you. All of you. That's all I ever wanted for this family, even when I didn't know how to say it. Marisol wrote back a single word. Thank you. It was the first time in 23 years I could remember her saying it and meaning it. I put that picture next to a different one on my desk, the one of Ren, Anson, and Beatrix from our camping trip that summer, all of us sunburned and laughing, nobody performing anything for anyone. I still think about that Tuesday morning sometimes, standing in my own conference room, reading a text message that told me I wasn't welcome at my own family's Christmas. I think about the 23 years that led up to it, the quiet checks, the folding chairs, the launch party I wasn't invited to, the phone call that finally told me the truth in words too plain to explain away. I don't regret what I did. I want to be honest about that, because I know some of you listening might be waiting for me to say I do, to wrap this up with some tidy lesson about forgiveness and family being worth any price. That's not the lesson I walked away with. The lesson I walked away with is that love which only shows up when it's convenient was never really love to begin with, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the people who take you for granted, and for yourself, is to finally let them feel the weight of what they were never willing to acknowledge. I think about the version of myself who stood in that conference room a year ago, reading that first text message, still believing, somewhere underneath the hurt, that if he just gave a little more, waited a little longer, the family he loved would finally turn around and see him. I wish I could tell that version of myself something that would have saved him a few of those years. But I'm not sure I would have listened back then. I think some lessons only take root once you've lived every single day leading up to them. So I'll ask you what I've been asking myself for a year now. Was I wrong to let my own parents learn that lesson the hardest way possible after 23 years of quietly hoping they'd learn it on their own? Was I wrong to finally choose my own children over a family that had never once chosen me? I still don't have a clean answer. But I've stopped waiting for one, and I've started building a life where my own kids never have to wonder if love in this family comes with a price tag attached. If this story hit close to home, if you've ever been the quiet one holding everything together while everyone else got the credit, I want you to know you're not alone, and you're allowed to stop. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like mine. This has been the Payback Diaries. If you've ever had to learn the hard way that you're allowed to put yourself first, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below.